Hi, I'm going to show you now how I make my scrolls. So I'm using the basic bread rolls recipe and I am just going to press start cooking and show you how the guided cooking works. So the first step is to mill some grains. If you want to use 100% white flour, just skip this step. And when it gets to adding the flour, do 500 grams instead of 400 grams. But I like milling my own grains. There's a whole heap of vitamins that are actually in freshly milled flour that is lost after 24 to 48 hours. So there's about 22 different vitamins in wheat grain alone. So if you want to get that goodness in there, mill it fresh. I'm using spelt grain, organic spelt grain that I get, which I prefer to use than normal wheat grain, but you can use absolutely anything. Buckwheat works. I've used different things over time, but here we go with the spelt grain just going in and press next. It tells you to put the lid on and press next. And I'm going to mill this for 1 minute on speed 9 and I'll pause the video because there's nothing to watch. But just turning up the dial. Okay, that has finished milling and so I can show you what we have. So we've just made a wholemeal flour there in 1 minute by milling our wheat grains. So the next step asks me to transfer it into a bowl. And you don't have to stress too much about getting it all out because whatever's left will just be in the bowl for the next step where we are going to be activating our yeast in our water. And yeah, that all looks good. So you can see our wholemeal flour there. Set that aside for later. And we carry on. So now we're going to add in our water. So the basic bread recipe mainly only has 5 ingredients. Plus the water, and then you can add in whatever extra things you want to add in. So water, and then it gives you the option of adding instant yeast or fresh yeast, and I've tried fresh yeast and didn't notice a difference and it's hard to find, so I carry on with the instant one that you can just find wherever. And 2 teaspoons goes in. When I'm adding it in, I just kind of watch to make sure I'm not putting it on that center piece of the blades. I'm just putting it, I'll show you, around in the water, just so it's all incorporated. And we are going to activate that. It tells you to put the lid on, and it is telling me to do that for 2 minutes on 37 degrees. So what I want to show you while that's cooking, if I just show you this screen here for a second. Anytime your Thermomix is doing something for you, as we all know, you don't need to be in the kitchen. It's working for you. It's hands-free. You don't need to be there. But if you want to multitask and look ahead, you can press these 3 dots up here and go to the recipe detail. Can you see? Kind of, there's a word there that says recipe detail, and it just brings you in to see, so you can look ahead. So while my yeast is activating, I could be going to grab my other ingredients out of the pantry. So it's asking me to get some oil, flour, salt, and then any seeds that I might want to add. If you want to look ahead at the next step so that you can just see, so you know what you're going to be doing, you can read those as well. Each recipe also has some hints, tips. Sometimes there's substitute ideas, and you've got your nutrition guide there as well. So the other thing you can do while it's cooking is press your home button and actually be searching on Cookie-Doo for the next thing you want to make. So that's another thing you can do all while it's cooking. And when you want to get back to the recipe you're in, just press the bookmark up there. So just a few screen tips to really be productive in the kitchen. I will pause and come back in another 30 seconds when this is done. Okay, so that's the yeast has been activating in that water, and that's the other thing I forgot to mention about how great the Thermomix temperature options are. So you've got that 37-degree option and it goes up in 5 degrees from there. So you can be really precise with what you're needing to cook. So activating yeast is perfect at your body temperature, which is 37 degrees. Now I'm just going to add in the oil, and I love the scales. I've got my oil drizzler here, and all I have to do is watch the scales to see when it's going to reach the target goal, I guess, for what we're wanting to add. I'm adding now baker's flour. Baker's flour is different to plain flour. So it's actually got more protein, more gluten. It makes a stronger bread. If you were to use plain flour, it would just be a bit crumblier, a bit more like plain flour is good for cakes. So I guess my message is find baker's flour if you can. It normally comes in a 5 kilo bag because they think if you're going to be doing baking, you need a lot of flour. So most breads need about 500 grams at a time. So, but if you only have plain flour and you want to give bread a go, just try it. It's not going to be the same, but it's still going to be good. Like, I guess what I'm saying is don't not make bread just because you can't find the flour or don't want to buy a big bag. So just give it a go. I'm adding in salt now. So for my salt, I use Himalayan rock salt that I mill myself in the Thermomix on speed 10 for about 10 seconds. And I keep it here in my container so that anytime I need cooking salt that's finely milled, I've got it there without any additives or anti-caking agents or whatever they put in it. So obviously if you're not fussed about the additives, like I know not everyone cares about that type of thing, just use your normal table or cooking salt or whatever. So now it's asking me to add back in our wholemeal flour. So that goes in and we put the lid on and combine just for 6 seconds. And then is the fun part of kneading. So it tells you to keep the measure cup in and it's going to go straight to dough mode. And all you have to do is turn the dial. I'm going to show you. I'll try my best to show you through the screen. You might not be able to see it perfectly. So it just, it gives a really strong push both directions and then pauses to let the dough kind of settle and move around. And this recipe needs the dough for 2 minutes. I forgot something. I like to add seeds. So I've got some chia seeds and linseeds. So you can just put them in while it's kneading and it will all mix through. So that's finished kneading. And those seeds were an optional extra. It's not in the recipe. Well, this recipe is for bread rolls where it tells you to sprinkle the seeds on top, but I'm making this into scrolls. So that's why I wanted to incorporate it into the actual dough. So I've got my dough here and flip it upside down. I'm going to rise it in my mat. It's a Thermomat. It's got fiberglass on the inside of this mat and then silicone on the outside to trap in the heat and really help your bread rise well, but it's also non-stick and really great for working with pastries and doughs, things like that. To get the dough out, I'm just twisting the blades and then it all just falls out nice and clean. And then I've actually got some, I don't know if you can see, of my seed goodness is around the top. So I'm just going to get some of my dough and go around and get all that because I don't want to waste that. And there's some in the lid too. And that doesn't always happen. I find it's random. Sometimes there's just some of the dough left up the top. So I'll set that aside. And all I'm going to do is work this into a bit of a ball or a log. If you don't have a Thermomat, you can leave your dough to rise in a bowl with a tea towel over it or in the thermo server, which is also, as we know, has thermal properties that traps in the heat. So that's another good place to rise your dough. I love the mat though, that's my favorite. So I'm just going to wrap it up, sort of not too tight, not too loose. You can see there's some space in there for that to rise really nicely. I'm going to set that aside and I'll come back when it's ready for the next step. Okay, we're back. This has been rising for a while. I'll just show you, I haven't moved it yet, but you can see it's very full now and it's starting to ooze out, which my kids always think is hilarious when that happens. But before I open that up, I'm just going to grate my cheese and my toppings of what I want in my scroll. So here's where I'm going to leave the recipe, because this recipe is to make rolls, and I'm not really making rolls, I'm making scrolls, but I did want to show you before I go. Some recipes have little videos in them to show you how to do the next step, and I think that's pretty cool. This one has a video showing you how to make the roll. So if you want to see that, find the basic bread recipe, and as you're going through, you see this little video that shows you how to do the next step. But yeah, I will just get out of that. Yeah, and it basically just says to put it in the oven. So I'm going to go home, because what I'm going to do now is grate the cheese. So I use, for my scrolls, I use about 200 grams of cheese, maybe a little bit more sometimes, depends what I'm putting in. And when I'm grating cheese, I first chop it in kind of cubes, and that's just to put less pressure on the blades over time, to make sure that they are just to make sure they are not putting that pressure on the blades. So that goes in. And sometimes I do cheese and herbs, or cheese and pineapple, or cheese and Vegemite. Today I'm going to do some cheese, spinach, and ham. And my butcher does this great home smoked ham, so I'm putting that in. And so it can all be grated together on speed 7 for about 5 or 6 seconds. So I'll get that moving there. So that was 6 seconds, and I'll just see what it looks like. If I need to go longer, I can go longer. Looks pretty good. So I've got a green cheese now. My kids love spinach, so that's all good. So I'm just going to roll this out. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing. Actually, before I do, I just kind of gather it up and knock it down. And so I've got my dough here, and I just try and roll it out the size of the mat, just so it's a big rectangle. And I won't bore you with that, because it's only a minute. But okay, I've got my rectangle here, and now I'm just going to add on the filling. Now the other recipes that you can use, so I use the basic bread rolls. There's a everyday white loaf, I think it's called everyday white loaf, on cookie dough. Some people use pizza dough. Whatever dough is your favorite dough recipe, just use that to make scrolls or rolls, or like you can change around the shape of any of the dough recipes, and that's what some people don't realize that you can do. Yeah, and change up your filling if you're doing scrolls. There's also sweet scrolls you can do, like cinnamon or apple and custard, or I don't know. Oh, coconut scrolls are good too. Okay, so kind of got my filling just roughly around everywhere. Cheese, spinach, and ham. And so what I do is I separate mine into 15 strips. So from here, sorry, before I cut it in strips, some people roll the whole thing up and cut each scroll individually and place them up. Some people roll this up and bake it like that and then slice it. I do mine a bit differently, just because I think this is just easier for me. Maybe I'm uncoordinated at one big scroll, but I find this really good just to cut my scrolls and roll them, cut my strips and scroll them individually. That's just what works for me. And I like to get 15 on my tray, so it's 3 by 5. And so half my kids take one because they've got smaller appetites, and the other half take 2. Whereas if I made them too big, then the ones who don't eat as much, it's too big for them. So the other thing to be conscious of when you're making your scrolls is not to make them too tall, or they literally do not fit in the lunch boxes. So if you want them bigger, try and make them wider. So a longer strip will make a nice wider scroll. So just a few things to be aware of. You can just play around with it. So on this mat, I'm using my spatula to cut my strips, because on this mat you can't use a knife. You don't want to cut through the silicone. So that's just another tip. But the spatula is sturdy enough to cut through the dough really nicely. You can get scraper dough cutters and things like that on the Thermomix online site. And I'm just going to bake it on the rose gold tray. You can see it's very well loved, but it's non-stick, so I don't need to put anything down. I could bake on this mat as well. It goes in the oven up to 280 degrees. But yeah, basically all I'm going to do is roll up each strip and put it that way on my tray. If the dough is sticky, or it's like, just different doughs have different textures. If it's not working for you, you can use your spatula to help guide you as you scroll it. This dough is just working really fine. I'm not having a problem with it. So I will carry on. Almost dropped my spatula. I will carry on scrolling this and placing them there, and I won't bore you with that. So there's my tray of scrolls, and I've got all this leftover cheese on my mat that fell off while I was doing that. I just like to kind of push down my scrolls. They will pop back up again, but this helps them kind of be a bit wider rather than taller, because they're going to rise again now. I rise this again for about 10 or 15 minutes. But before I do that, look how pretty they look. Before I do that, I just will sprinkle what's left. If you don't want to do that, because it does ruin the effect of the scroll a little, it doesn't look as pretty, but you could just keep that cheese to add into whatever else you're making it over the next day or so. You could add it into pasta or make a grilled cheese, whatever, I don't know. But there you have our scroll. So now I have put the oven on. I just turned it on before I pressed record on the video. So the oven's preheating while the scrolls will rise again for about 10-15 minutes, and it's in the hot oven, so about 200, but I'll just set that aside while the oven preheats. Okay, so they have risen, and I put them in the oven at about 200 degrees for 15 minutes, and so there they all are. I will leave them on the bench to cool, and once they've cooled, I can show you what it looks like on the inside. They smell really good. Okay, they've cooled down a bit, and I just wanted to show you the inside. If I just break a few apart, just super fluffy, soft on the inside, crisp on the outside with the cheese. But yeah, really beautiful and soft on the inside, which is perfect. I usually put these in the freezer for like tomorrow. They'd eat them fresh, but then I keep them in the freezer, and each morning the kids just grab one out and put it in their lunchbox. By lunchtime it's defrosted. If they're eating it at home, they heat it up in the microwave, so it's just a bit softer and a bit nicer that way. But yeah, there's my scrolls.